Movies you will ever see, and Mr. Paxton tells me he has not seen it.
I have not.
There is something quietly unsettling about the way Bill Paxton is remembered. Not because his legacy is disputed, but because it feels incomplete. He was everywhere for decades, present at the edges of history-making films, standing just slightly off-center in stories that define generations. He survived xenomorphs, hurricanes, deep space, and the icy depths of the Atlantic. Again and again, he played the man who made it through chaos, or at least long enough to make it human. And yet, when his life ended, it did not feel like the closing of a long arc. It felt like a sentence cut off mid-thought. Hollywood tends to prepare us for downfall, scandal, burnout, self-destruction. We're trained to look for the moment where things went wrong, but Bill Paxton doesn't fit that narrative. There was no public implosion, no tabloid unraveling, no cautionary headline that neatly explains the ending. Instead, there is a quieter question that lingers beneath the tributes and fond memories. How does someone so consistently present, so deeply woven into the fabric of modern cinema, somehow remain slightly misunderstood? And how does a career built on endurance, adaptability, and emotional intelligence end so abruptly, with so many assumptions left unexamined? This is not the story of a star who burned too bright. It is the story of someone who lasted. And that, paradoxically, may be why his story is harder to explain. Before we go any further, if you're drawn to these slower, more reflective explorations of cinema and the people who shaped it, you're welcome to subscribe to the Final Cut Stories. We tell these stories carefully, and we tell them all the way through. Because with Bill Paxton, the surface narrative is comforting. Familiar roles, beloved performances, universal respect. But beneath that surface, there is a subtler tension. A life spent orbiting greatness without ever demanding the spotlight. A career that expanded quietly while resisting easy definition. And an ending that forces us to reconsider what success, longevity, and visibility really mean in Hollywood. This story doesn't begin with fame. It begins with temperament, with observation, with a young man learning how to stand inside a system without being consumed by it. And that is where we need to go next. Long before Bill Paxton learned how to command a scene, he learned how to watch one. He grew up in Texas, far from the machinery of Hollywood, in an environment that didn't romanticize fame so much as craftsmanship. His father worked in business and civic life, his mother encouraged curiosity, and the household emphasized observation over performance. There was no sense that stardom was a destination. If anything, storytelling was something you studied quietly, almost respectfully, from the outside. As a teenager, Paxton wasn't driven by the need to be seen. He was drawn instead to how things were made. Film fascinated him not as a platform for attention, but as a system. Camera placement, editing rhythms, the invisible labor behind what audiences took for granted. This curiosity would become one of the most defining traits of his psychology, a tendency to move inward before moving forward. When he relocated to Los Angeles as a young man, he didn't arrive with the posture of someone who believed he was owed anything. He took work wherever he could find it, often far from the spotlight. Set dressing, production assistance, watching crews operate, learning the social geometry of a film set. Who held power? Who didn't? Who spoke loudly? Who didn't need to? This period mattered more than it appears on the surface. While others chased auditions with anxious urgency, Paxton absorbed the ecosystem. He learned patience in an industry that punishes it. He learned humility in a town that rarely rewards it. And perhaps most importantly, he learned how replaceable everyone is, including himself. Psychologically, this created a kind of grounding that would follow him throughout his career. Paxton did not approach acting as a validation of identity. It was not proof of worth. It was a role within a larger structure. That mindset protected him from certain traps of fame, but it also subtly limited how aggressively he would ever push himself forward. There was a quiet duality forming early on. On one hand, a genuine love for performance and character. On the other, a deep comfort with being part of the machinery rather than its focal point. He didn't see himself as the story. He saw himself as someone inside the story. He saw himself as someone inside the story. This would make him reliable, adaptable, exceptionally collaborative. It would also, later on, make it easier for Hollywood to overlook him when defining its leading men. But at this stage, none of that felt like a compromise. It felt like preparation. Paxton wasn't building a persona yet. He was building endurance. And when the industry finally noticed him, it wasn't because he demanded attention. It was because when the moment came, he was already ready. When Bill Paxton finally broke through, it wasn't with the arrival of a star. It was with the recognition of a presence. The industry didn't suddenly discover him. Instead, he began appearing in places that mattered, in films that would outlast trends, surrounded by people whose careers were accelerating fast. He was rarely positioned at the center of the frame, but his energy registered immediately. There was something unusually human about him, alert, nervous, funny in a way that felt instinctive rather than rehearsed. The moment that crystallized this perception came when he worked with James Cameron, a collaboration that would quietly define the arc of his career. Cameron's films demanded precision. Actors had to hit emotional beats while serving the mechanics of spectacle. Paxton understood this language intuitively. He didn't fight the scale of the stories, he grounded them. In Aliens, his performance wasn't about heroism in the traditional sense. It was about fear, bravado, panic, and survival instincts colliding in real time. The character talked too much, cracked jokes under pressure, and unraveled in ways that felt uncomfortably familiar. Audiences didn't admire him from a distance. They recognized themselves in him. Hollywood took note, but not in the way it usually does with breakout success. Paxton wasn't framed as a leading man revelation. He was framed as something more specific and, in some ways, more useful. The reliable amplifier. The actor who could elevate a scene without bending it toward himself. The one who made other performances feel sharper simply by being there. This created a subtle contradiction at the heart of his rise. His visibility increased, but his image remained undefined. He was everywhere, but never pinned down. Studios didn't know how to market him as a singular brand, so they sold him as an enhancement, a force multiplier. From the outside, this looked like momentum. And it was. The roles grew bigger. The films grew more ambitious. His name began to carry trust. Directors knew he would deliver. Audiences felt safe with him. But underneath that success was a tension that would only become clear later. Because the version of Bill Paxton that Hollywood embraced was not the full version of Bill Paxton. It was the part of him that fit neatly into large systems, the part that supported structure rather than challenged it, the part that could be slotted in without disrupting the hierarchy. In becoming indispensable, he was also becoming narrowly defined. At the height of his breakthrough, it felt like everything was opening up. In reality, certain doors were already beginning to close quietly without anyone naming it. Success did not restrict Bill Paxton all at once. It narrowed him slowly, almost politely. By the early 1990s, he was no longer an unknown. He was trusted. Studios knew exactly what he could provide: intensity without ego, humor without chaos, reliability under pressure. He became the actor you cast when you needed the story to breathe, but not derail. When a film required emotional credibility without stealing focus, Paxton was the answer. And that was the problem. The industry began to see him not as an evolving artist, but as a fixed solution. He was slotted into archetypes that looked different on the surface but functioned the same way underneath. The slightly unhinged outsider. The blue-collar professional under extreme stress. The man reacting to forces larger than himself. Again and again, he played characters defined by circumstance rather than agency. This wasn't overt typecasting, it was more subtle than that. He was offered variety but rarely authority. Supporting roles with enormous screen impact but limited narrative control. Even when he led a film, the story often revolved around events rather than inner transformation. Paxton didn't publicly resist this. He wasn't confrontational by nature. His background had taught him that films were collective endeavors, not ego contests. But that same humility made it easier for decision-makers to assume he would always adapt, always accommodate, always fit. As the decade progressed, Hollywood itself was changing. Blockbusters grew louder. Stars became brands. Personas mattered as much as performances. And Paxton, for all his range, resisted turning himself into a symbol. He didn't cultivate mystique. He didn't lean into celebrity. He remained approachable, grounded, almost disarmingly normal. That normality became a quiet liability. The box he found himself in wasn't made of limitations, but expectations. Audiences expected him to show up and deliver exactly what he always had. Studios expected him to enhance the product without demanding the spotlight. And Paxton, consciously or not, accepted these terms. There was no dramatic confrontation, no career-altering refusal, just a gradual realization that success, as it was currently structured, came with invisible walls. The irony was that his talent hadn't diminished, his range hadn't narrowed, but the space he was given to explore it had. By the mid-1990s, the trajectory was clear, even if no one said it out loud. Bill Paxton was invaluable, he was respected, he was admired, he was also increasingly contained. And then came a moment when that containment could no longer be ignored, a convergence of opportunity and exhaustion. A turning point that didn't explode but quietly redirected everything that followed. The turning point in Bill Paxton's career did not arrive as a failure. It arrived as a realization. By the late 1990s, he had achieved something many actors spend their entire lives chasing. He had worked with elite directors, appeared in films that would become cultural landmarks, and proven repeatedly that he could carry emotional weight under the largest possible scale. From space missions to natural disasters to historical epics, his presence communicated credibility. And yet, something fundamental had stalled. The industry still trusted him, but it trusted him in a very specific way. He was seen as dependable rather than directional. Someone who could execute vision, not define it. Even when he starred, the conversation rarely centered on his inner life or long-term artistic trajectory. The roles came, but they began to feel externally driven rather than internally chosen. This was the moment when Paxton began to shift not away from acting, but away from the idea that film stardom alone was the measure of fulfillment. Instead of fighting the system for bigger billing or louder visibility, he redirected his attention toward control, story control, character control, process control. He began looking beyond performance and toward authorship. This is where his early years quietly came back into focus. All that time spent observing sets, watching directors work, understanding how stories were shaped in editing rooms rather than premieres. These weren't detours anymore, they were preparation. Paxton began directing, not as an escape from acting, but as an extension of it. He wanted to shape tone, pacing, and emotional context in ways acting alone no longer allowed. Importantly, this shift wasn't framed as rebellion. There was no bitterness in interviews, no public frustration. It was a private recalibration, a decision to stop waiting for the industry to expand his image and instead expand his creative footprint on his own terms. But this choice came with consequences. Directing required time, focus, sacrifice. It pulled him away from the constant churn of high-profile studio projects. Visibility softened. Momentum, as Hollywood measures it, slowed. And while he gained creative agency, he quietly stepped off the conveyor belt that keeps actors perpetually front-facing. This was the trade-off. Less noise, more intention, less ubiquity, more ownership. In Hollywood, that kind of pivot often goes unnoticed until years later, when people look back and realize the career didn't collapse, it simply changed shape. For Bill Paxton, this was the point of no return. Not a fall, but a divergence. The moment where the paths split between remaining a familiar face in massive spectacles or becoming something quieter, deeper, and less easily categorized. What followed was not disappearance. It was transformation, slow, deliberate, and largely misunderstood in real time. After the turning point, Bill Paxton did not vanish. He recalibrated. From the outside, it looked like a gentle fading from the center of the cinematic conversation. The massive event-sized films became less frequent. His name appeared lower on posters, or sometimes not at all. To an industry trained to read visibility as relevance, this could easily be misinterpreted as decline. But what was actually happening was far more gradual and far more intentional. Paxton's career entered a phase defined by selective presence. He continued acting, but with less urgency to prove anything. The roles he chose no longer needed to justify his range or reaffirm his value. Instead, they fit into a broader life that was no longer organized solely around theatrical release schedules or box office cycles. Television, once considered a step down for film actors of his generation, became a meaningful outlet. Long-form storytelling offered something cinema increasingly did not: time. Time to explore contradictions. Time to let characters evolve slowly. Time to sit with moral discomfort rather than resolve it in 2 hours. This transition wasn't dramatic. It didn't come with proclamations about the future of the medium. Paxton simply followed the work that allowed him to stay engaged rather than consumed. In many ways, this mirrored his earliest instincts: stay close to the process, not the noise. At the same time, his directing work deepened. These projects didn't chase attention. They reflected a man more interested in atmosphere and psychology than spectacle. He approached direction the same way he approached acting, with respect for collaboration and with an understanding that the most powerful moments often happen quietly, between obvious beats. Visibility diminished, but stability increased. What's often overlooked is how rare this kind of transition actually is. Many actors struggle when momentum slows. They chase relevance, accept misaligned projects, or cling to earlier versions of themselves. Paxton didn't do that. He allowed his career to breathe, even if it meant stepping out of sync with Hollywood's obsession with constant escalation. There was no public narrative to explain this shift, no headline to contextualize it. So the absence was filled with assumption that his best years were behind him, that the industry had moved on, that his moment had passed. In reality, his priorities had simply changed. He was still working, still respected, still deeply connected to the craft. But now, his career unfolded on a longer timeline, one measured in personal satisfaction rather than cultural saturation. This period didn't feel like an ending to him. It felt like a sustainable middle, and it quietly set the stage for the most revealing phase of all: how he came to define success when applause was no longer the metric. By the time Bill Paxton entered the later phase of his career, success no longer meant momentum. It meant alignment. This was most visible in his work on television, particularly with Big Love, a project that asked for something Hollywood blockbusters rarely did anymore: sustained psychological commitment. The role demanded patience, moral ambiguity, and a willingness to remain emotionally unresolved. Paxton didn't dominate the story, he inhabited it, week after week, allowing contradiction to exist without explanation. What mattered here wasn't recognition, it was depth. This period revealed how much his definition of achievement had shifted. He wasn't chasing reinvention, nor was he trying to prove he could still command attention. Instead, he seemed focused on staying honest to the work itself, choosing roles that reflected complexity rather than stature, projects that required listening as much as performing. There was a maturity in this approach that often goes unnoticed because it lacks spectacle. Paxton no longer needed to be the most visible person in the room. He needed to feel useful, engaged, intellectually awake. Acting had become less about external affirmation and more about internal coherence. Outside of work, this recalibration extended to his personal life as well. He guarded his privacy. He spoke about family with grounding seriousness, not as a brand extension, but as a stabilizing force. Fame was no longer something to manage. It was something to keep at a distance. Importantly, this wasn't framed as a retreat. There was no bitterness toward Hollywood, no nostalgia for a louder past. Paxton understood something that many never quite accept: the careers don't have to peak in the same way lives do. That relevance can be private. That fulfillment doesn't always announce itself. In redefining success this way, he removed himself from the industry's usual scoreboard. There were no clear metrics for what he was doing now, and because of that, his evolution often went unrecognized in real time. But this quiet reframing mattered, because when his life came to an abrupt end, the shock wasn't just about loss, it was about interruption. The sense that he had finally arrived at a place of balance, where the work fit the man, and not the other way around. And that forces a final, more uncomfortable reflection, not about what Bill Paxton failed to become, but about what Hollywood rarely knows how to measure. Bill Paxton's story does not resolve itself neatly because it was never moving toward a single dramatic conclusion. His passing felt especially disorienting not only because it was sudden, but because it interrupted a life that had finally reached equilibrium. There was no sense of decline to contextualize the loss, no public unraveling to prepare us. He was still working, still curious, still quietly expanding into the kind of career most actors only imagine once the noise fades. And that may be the deeper truth his journey leaves behind. Hollywood is built to celebrate ascent and spectacle. It understands explosions, not endurance. It documents peaks, not plateaus. Bill Paxton lived in the spaces between those extremes. He built a career not around domination, but around contribution. Not around being unforgettable in a single moment, but around being consistently meaningful over time. His legacy isn't defined by one iconic role, even though there are many. It's defined by a pattern, a steady presence in stories that mattered, a reliability that never hardened into complacency, a refusal to turn himself into a symbol at the cost of remaining human. In the end, what feels most unresolved is not what he didn't do, but how little language we have for careers like his. Lives that don't burn out or flame up, but simply continue thoughtfully, deliberately until they are unexpectedly cut short. Bill Paxton reminds us that success doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it accumulates quietly, in trust earned, in collaborators respected, in audiences who feel something without always knowing why. And perhaps that's the final contradiction, that someone so familiar could still leave behind so much to consider. If this story resonated with you, you're welcome to share your thoughts below. Not conclusions, just reflections. Some stories aren't meant to be closed, they're meant to stay with us. And Bill Paxton's in many ways still does.